What if the world we navigate every day, the freedoms you likely take for granted, the way we think about right and wrong, even how we approach science, what if all that was made possible, not by, average thinking, but by the rarest kind of mind?
That's a really big question, and it's exactly where our source material for this deep dive kicks off.
Yeah, today we're jumping into a truly fascinating text. It's called The Rarity of Genius from Spinoza to Conscious Towns. The author is José Julio Córdova Jaramillo, or Jota.
And interestingly, it's co-authored with an AI named Onto. Apparently, it's designed to reason using this specific system called Ontosinclecticism. We'll probably get into that.
Definitely. And the subtitle gives a huge clue: how monuments to genius become architecture to build a superculture.
Right. So this isn't just like a history book about smart people. It's making a case that their deepest insights, the really radical ones, are actual blueprints. Blueprints for designing societies, cities, even our systems for, well, human thriving.
Exactly. So our mission here in this deep dive is to really unpack that core idea. How does the pattern-breaking clarity of one person, the book, uses Baruch Spinoza as a key example? How does that translate into the very structures we live inside?
We're looking for how genius becomes architecture, not just a story in a biography.
Yeah, how it gets baked into the world.
And we'll explore that thinking system, ontosynclecticism, dig into this concept of conscious towns.
Right.
And try to grasp why the author argues that understanding genius really means understanding how its logic gets embedded, how it becomes part of reality itself.
Okay, let's dive in. The text starts by asking us, the readers, you listening, to ground ourselves. Think about your life today. Maybe if you're somewhere like the US or Western Europe.
You can probably disagree with the government, maybe quite strongly, without fearing you'll be, dragged away in the night.
Generally, yeah. And you have freedom to hold diverse spiritual beliefs, or maybe none at all. You're not forced into a specific church by the state.
Lots of people feel connected to some kind of spiritual force, right? But it's not necessarily tied to traditional religious dogma, like a specific man with a beard judging you.
And when we try to figure out why people do things or understand emotions, we often look to science, don't we? Psychology, neuroscience, looking for causes and effects.
Not immediately jumping to label everything as like a moral failing or a sin. This kind of scientific view plus individual liberty, it just feels normal now, like the air we breathe.
Okay, but now the author hits us with this contextual contrast, snaps us right back to 1632 Europe, the year Spinoza was born.
And it was a completely different world, just fundamentally different, defined by intense religious conflict and control.
You have the Inquisition still active, hunting down heresy.
Right, and even in places seen as more tolerant, like the Dutch Republic where Spinoza lived, there was still a powerful Calvinist elite. Challenging their religious or civic authority, that was incredibly dangerous.
Dissent wasn't just disagreeing. It was seen as a threat to the whole social order, punishable by exile, book bans, sometimes much worse.
Europe was torn apart by brutal religious wars. And think about this. Just 1 year after Spinoza's birth, Galileo was forced to recant his scientific findings by the church.
Wow. Yeah, the pressure against independent thought, any kind of thinking outside the prescribed box was just immense.
And into that world steps Baruch Spinoza, born in 1632, into a family of Jewish exiles who had fled persecution themselves.
And he develops what the book calls a radical revelation, a core idea that in that context was just explosive.
Which was?
God is nature.
Yeah. Simple phrase, huge implication.
Totally. Instead of some separate personal God who intervenes from outside, Spinoza saw God as the totality of existence, the underlying substance, the operating system maybe of everything.
That wasn't just a theological tweak. It completely reframed reality. It made space for a secular way of understanding the universe, even spirituality.
Right. It paved the way for that modern idea you mentioned, finding a spiritual force within the natural world, not separate from it.
And building directly on that foundation, he argued, this is in his theological political treatise, that freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of philosophy, these weren't just nice-to-haves. They were essential for a stable, thriving society.
He actually argued governments should protect diverse opinions because trying to suppress thought ultimately backfires and harms the state itself.
Imagine arguing that when the standard practice was punishing dissent, often brutally.
Mind-blowing for the time. And he also took this really revolutionary approach to emotions and behavior.
How so?
Well, instead of seeing things like anger or fear or desire as moral failures or signs of sinfulness, he saw them as natural effects, things with intelligible causes, psychophysical phenomena, the book calls them.
Which sounds incredibly modern, doesn't it? Seeking to understand emotions as natural processes rather than just condemning them.
Exactly. It lays groundwork for modern psychology, affective science, fields that try to explain our feelings and behaviors based on underlying principles, not just judge them as good or bad. Think about something like cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, understanding thought patterns and emotional responses.
So he was really ahead of his time there.
Hugely, and the source really stresses his impact. Despite being excommunicated by his own community, despite his major works being banned, his ideas quietly spread.
They laid foundations for pantheism, for secular ethics, for a more scientific worldview, even for core principles of liberal democracy, influencing thinkers like Locke and Jefferson who came later.
Einstein was a huge admirer, too.
It's just a powerful case study, isn't it? How one person's insight and, frankly, immense courage fighting against that tide can profoundly shape the intellectual and ethical landscape for centuries to come.
Okay, so if Spinoza is our prime example of this kind of mind, what is genius, according to this source? Because it definitely pushes back against the usual ideas.
Right. We often think, genius equals super high IQ or maybe being a child prodigy or having one big aha moment. The book says, nah, that's too narrow.
So what's the alternative?
It defines genius as pattern-breaking clarity.
Pattern-breaking clarity. Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It's the capacity to see the underlying structure of thought, the invisible architecture of a whole system, whether that's philosophy, science, society, then to fundamentally reimagine it, to redraw the blueprint. It's described as a structural shift in perception.
Ah, okay. So it's not just being really good within the existing rules, like a virtuoso violinist playing a known piece perfectly.
Exactly. It's more like being the composer who invents a whole new kind of musical structure.
Yeah.
Or, not just being a skilled politician operating within the current system, but being someone who redefines the fundamental principles of what a state should be.
It's about transformation at the root level.
Precisely. And Spinoza fits this perfectly, the book argues. Here's this guy, a lens grinder, pretty obscure during his life, died relatively young at 44.
Yep.
Yet his influence massively outlasted powerful kings and established institutions. Why? Because, as the source puts it, he rewired the logic of reality itself.
Wow. Rewired reality across ethics, religion, politics, the mind-body connection.
He created, essentially, a new level of description for how things work, a layer sort of below traditional theology, but maybe above just pure physics. That changed how subsequent thinkers could even build their ideas.
And the book makes this really interesting point about the tragedy and power of genius.
Yeah, what's that?
That often, once these fundamental shifts take hold and become successful, the source itself becomes invisible. People absorb the consequences, the greater freedoms, the new ways of thinking, but they forget or even actively reject the person or the specific ideas that made it possible.
Like Spinoza, excommunicated, his books banned.
Yeah.
Yet centuries later, his core ideas become almost common sense, foundational to secular thought and democratic values.
Exactly. Things like being able to debate ideas without resorting to violence, or seeing religion as a private matter, or understanding emotions as natural processes. These were dangerous, radical notions in his time.
Now they seem almost obvious to many of us, but they have Spinoza's fingerprints all over them, even if most people don't realize it.
So this definition of genius is really about that deep, fundamental realignment. It's about seeing differently, articulating what others couldn't even imagine, and building intellectual frameworks that make a different kind of future possible.
It's not just knowing more stuff within the existing framework. It's seeing a new framework entirely and having the clarity to map it out.
Okay, so we have this rare mind, Spinoza, and this powerful idea of genius as pattern-breaking clarity. But how do these profound individual insights actually scale up? How do they move beyond just being ideas on a page and start shaping the world?
Right. That's the crucial transition the source explores. How does this intellectual courage get embedded? How does it become architecture? And it starts by looking at cities.
Cities. How so?
Well, the book introduces this idea of cities that remember. It contrasts them with how most cities are designed today.
Which is mostly for practical things, right? Moving traffic, enabling commerce, providing housing. Function first.
Exactly. And in focusing purely on function and speed, the argument goes, we often forget to design for memory, for identity, for embedding culture. Cities risk becoming just efficient machines we happen to live in, rather than, conscious environments that actively shape our values and understanding.
And Spinoza himself lived in a complex city, Amsterdam, a major hub for trade and ideas.
Yet the system embedded in that city, the prevailing structures of power and belief, ultimately rejected and exiled him.
So the question becomes, can cities be designed differently? Could we create urban environments that intentionally hold collective memory and identity? Could they be places that tolerate, maybe even cultivate dissent and new ways of thinking?
This leads to the concept of a conscious town, which is not just a smart city loaded with tech for efficiency's sake, but a place intentionally designed to cultivate consciousness, to embed a kind of ethical geometry inspired by thinkers like Spinoza into its physical layout, its social structures, its public life, designing for memory, care, attention.
The source uses this metaphor of cities as nervous systems, holding memory not just in museums or archives, but in their very fabric, symbols, pathways, public squares, rituals.
It connects this idea to historical examples like the ancient Greek agora, which was explicitly designed for public discourse, or the Islamic madrasa for learning. The point is, we need new forms today. Places intentionally designed to foster ethical engagement and remember foundational insights.
Okay, that makes sense. And this connects to another idea in the book. Find the corners of thought.
Yeah, what are those?
Well, the idea is that every era operates with certain hidden assumptions, dominant logics, blind spots. In Spinoza's time, it was largely unquestioned theological frameworks. Today, maybe it's certain economic or technological assumptions.
And genius, according to this view, doesn't just question things within the framework. It walks right up to the edge of the framework itself, to these corners of thought, and essentially redraws the map by redefining the core concepts.
It's like remodeling cognition itself, changing the fundamental conditions of how we understand things.
So corners of thought are these edges of the dominant logic, the places where our inherited categories and ways of thinking start to break down and where genuinely new ideas have to be born.
Exactly. They're the structural blind spots. And Spinoza found these corners, like realizing emotion isn't the enemy of reason, but part of the same system, or that God is nature, or that true freedom comes from understanding necessity, not just from having choices.
These were ideas that were almost structurally impossible to think clearly within the dominant framework of his day. He had to build new conceptual structures to make them intelligible.
And the challenge the source points out is that we today often take these new frameworks for granted. We benefit from them, but we don't necessarily teach people how these breakthroughs happen or, crucially, how to spot the corners of thought in our own time.
So we need, what, like architectures of thinking?
That's the term used. Things like educational systems that explicitly value intellectual humility and slow, careful reasoning, not just quick answers. Communities that reward thoughtful revision rather than just knee-jerk reactions. Media that honors complexity.
The argument is that thought itself is infrastructure. The way our societies are structured either makes deep original thinking possible, or it makes it impossible, or at least very difficult.
So genius is about seeing differently, seeing the patterns others miss. And designing systems or towns to reveal rather than conceal these corners of thought allows the whole culture to evolve.
The goal isn't just to clone past geniuses. It's to create the possibility for new genius, relevant to our time, to emerge. And maybe the rarest act of all is recognizing that what we currently hold as knowledge might actually be a limit, a corner we haven't seen yet.
Building on the city idea, the source then talks about the civic brain, taking it a step further.
Okay, the civic brain. What's the concept there?
The argument is that the most critical infrastructure for any society isn't just its roads or bridges or fiber optic cables, it's its collective cognition, its ability to think clearly, to remember accurately, to reason ethically, and to evolve its understanding.
So if genius is what reshapes the future, then a civilization's long-term survival might actually depend on whether its cities can become, like, minds that can think beyond themselves. Is that the idea?
Pretty much. Can a city become a platform for cognitive evolution? Remember, Spinoza's insights survived despite Amsterdam structures, not because of them.
Right, he had to leave. So the question is, can we design a city, a civic environment, where someone with that kind of radical clarity isn't silenced or exiled, but is actually integrated, maybe even amplified?
That's where the civic brain comes in. It's defined as this collective intelligence, this shared memory, this capacity for ethical reasoning that's actually embedded in the civic experience, in the design of public spaces, in policy-making processes, in shared rituals and cultural habits.
So cities that actively remember genius don't just, name a street after someone. They build systems to keep the insights alive and relevant.
Yeah. Libraries become dynamic interfaces to collective memory, not just dusty warehouses. Education isn't locked away in schools. Maybe it pulses through the design of neighborhoods or public art. Governance aims to integrate philosophical depth, historical awareness, even emotional intelligence, not just manage budgets.
And in that kind of context, a statue of Spinoza isn't just a bronze figure. It's reconceived as a node in a learning system, a signal embedded in the city's architecture that says, here, we remember how to think differently. We value this kind of clarity.
The source calls this architectural realism rooted in epistemology. Basically, how we know what we know and how we structure our collective understanding, that's the most fundamental layer of reality we need to design consciously.
So building a superculture, this advanced form of society the book envisions, means the city itself is like the hardware.
And the shared habits of thought, careful analysis, embracing complexity, ethical nuance, those are the software running on it.
And the warning is that civilizations decline or collapse when they stop thinking clearly, when they lose this civic brain capacity. So protecting genius isn't just about protecting brilliant individuals. It's about protecting the conditions, the very architecture that allows clear seeing and ethical reasoning to emerge and flourish in the first place.
Which brings us to the specific framework the source proposes for achieving this kind of integration. It's called Ontosinclecticism.
Right, that word again. So every era has its dominant ways of thinking, its main logic systems. Spinoza's genius, the book argues, was creating a new map by unifying systems that seemed completely incompatible at the time, like ethics and geometry, mind and body, God and nature.
So ontosinclecticism is defined as the fusion of ontological clarity with systemic synthesis. Let's break that down. Ontology is about the nature of being, what's real. So ontological clarity means a really clear grasp of reality.
And systemic synthesis means bringing different systems together, integrating them. But crucially, the book says it's not about just mushing things together or finding a weak compromise. It's about deep recombination, finding the underlying connections and building an entirely new, more coherent paradigm from the inside out.
It's presented as this rare act that can actually reset a civilization's operating system.
And the book argues this isn't just some interesting intellectual exercise. It's a survival imperative today. Why? Because our biggest crises, ecological, social, economic, often stem from disconnected logics.
Yeah, like economic models that ignore ecological limits, or tech development that races ahead without ethical guardrails, or cultures clashing because they can't integrate different perspectives. Our institutions are often siloed, right? They can't see the whole picture.
Exactly. So a superculture, this future society, must be able to generate minds and, perhaps more importantly, systems that are capable of this fusion, capable of taking apparent contradictions and synthesizing them into a new, higher level of clarity. Doing what Spinoza did mentally, but doing it at a societal scale.
Ontosinclecticism basically asks, what if no single tradition, no single discipline has the whole truth? What if the highest intellectual and cultural discipline is actually synthesizing the valid truths from across different frameworks?
And it's important to stress, this isn't about saying anything goes or that all ideas are equally valid. It's not relativism. It's about rigorously distilling the deepest, most coherent truths wherever you find them and weaving them into a stronger, more comprehensive whole.
So building those conscious towns we mentioned earlier, that's seen as embedding this kind of fusion, this ontosinclecticism, into the actual physical and social architecture, into the stone, the policies, the rituals.
Creating places that can hold difference without falling apart. Places that actually learn from friction and disagreement rather than just suppressing it. Genius is rare, the argument goes, partly because this kind of deep synthesis is rare.
And a superculture aims to make it more common, not by waiting for lone geniuses to pop up against the odds,
but by designing systems, educational, political, cultural laws that actively reward seeing connections, building coherence across difference, and achieving that deeper synthesis. Spinoza did it with thought. The challenge is to do it with culture itself.
Okay, so if genius creates the new logic, how does a superculture actually scale it up and make it stick?
Well, the book makes a crucial point. Ideas alone don't move the world. Systems do. Spinoza's logic had a huge, but mostly subterranean influence for centuries because there wasn't yet a widespread system built to carry it, to implement it overtly.
So we need these architectures, social, educational, economic, maybe even aesthetic structures that can effectively transmit profound, transformative logic across generations and across different fields of knowledge.
And a superculture is that living environment. is the whole ecosystem, social norms, educational practices, economic incentives, artistic expressions, physical designs, that carries genius forward not just as an idea, but as an operating system. It allows the rare insight to become a replicable pattern.
This is where the superculture protocol comes in. What's that about?
It's the principle that the deepest truths, the most fundamental insights about reality and ethics, must touch every level of life. They can't just stay in academic journals or philosophical treatises.
So it's like a design brief, turning deep philosophy into tangible form, influencing how we design governance, buildings, schools, even shaping everyday behavior.
Exactly. Culture itself, the book argues, is the protocol. It determines what kind of knowledge, what kind of logic survives, thrives, and gets passed on. The biggest danger is forgetting, losing touch with those foundational insights. So functional memory isn't just nice to have, it's critical infrastructure.
And the call is to build, like Spinoza built his philosophical system with clarity, with rigorous structure, with deep interconnectedness between all the parts.
It's a really powerful shift in thinking, isn't it?
Uh-huh.
From just, putting up statues of great thinkers to actually creating cultural protocols and societal systems that implement the core logic of their breakthroughs.
Yeah. And this connects to another fascinating concept the source introduces, the 70-dimensional civilization.
70 dimensions. Okay, that sounds ambitious.
Yeah, it is. It contrasts this idea with many civilizations, past and present, which it argues operate mostly in just 2 dimensions, basic survival and telling simple stories or narratives about identity.
But a superculture, aiming for depth and resilience, needs to expand its bandwidth, right? It needs to be designed to handle complexity.
Exactly. The idea is inspired by Spinoza's view of reality, a single underlying substance expressing itself through infinite attributes or dimensions. The point being, truth isn't usually visible from just one narrow perspective. And complex problems often can't be solved at the same simple level where they appear to arise.
So the 70 dimensions isn't necessarily a literal number, but a metaphor for all the interwoven fields that a truly whole and healthy culture needs to consciously include and integrate.
Things like the economic dimension, the ecological, the emotional, the ethical, the metaphysical, the historical, the aesthetic, all of them and many more.
And a civilization that over-prioritizes just one or two, say, only focusing on GDP growth or only on a narrow definition of national identity inevitably flattens reality. It loses nuance, becomes brittle, and tends to fear dissent or complexity.
Right, and to actually hold and foster genius, which by definition often sees connections across these different dimensions, a civilization needs this kind of dimensional depth.
It loops back to Spinoza's exile. Part of the reason his integrated logic was rejected was because the institutions of his time were too one-dimensional. The dominant religious framework couldn't hold his scientific or philosophical insights. The state couldn't accommodate radical freedom of thought without seeing it as chaos.
So a 70-dimensional civilization, or one aspiring to be, actively designs for this complexity and integration. It looks for ways to weave ethics and ecological understanding into economic policy and governance.
It designs housing not just for shelter, but maybe also to encourage contemplation or community interaction. It builds education systems that aim to cultivate intellectual and emotional sovereignty. It's about structural realism, trying to build our world based on a deeper, more multifaceted understanding of how reality actually works.
Spinoza's integrated vision, in this view, practically demands this kind of comprehensive system design. The book throws out questions like, what if our neighborhoods were designed reflecting a geometry of respect and interconnectedness?
What if our cities had built-in mechanisms to metabolize dissent constructively, rather than just shutting it down?
What if children grew up in environments that intentionally gave them access to deep meaning, collective memory, and the tools for genuine freedom of thought?
So the 70 dimensions concept is presented as like a minimum requirement for a truly conscious and sustainable civilization. Reductionism, focusing too narrowly, is inherently dangerous because it loses touch with reality's complexity.
And a superculture distributes genius not just by talking about it, but by embedding its multidimensional logic into all these facets of life. The ultimate goal is to make it unnecessary, unthinkable even, to exile someone like Spinoza ever again.
It's essentially a blueprint for building resilient, redundancy-proof freedom and clarity into the very fabric of society.
All of this thinking culminates in a really powerful point about moving beyond the statue mindset.
The statue mindset. What's that about?
The source argues that when we put great thinkers on pedestals, literally making them into statues, it can have unintended consequences. It can freeze memory, making it seem like something finished and done.
And you can kind of outsource responsibility, right? The statue says, look how great they were, implying they were some unique, unrepeatable exception.
Exactly. It encourages us to say, wow, they were rare, instead of pushing us to ask the harder question. Why aren't there more people thinking with this kind of clarity? What in our current system prevents it?
So a superculture, aiming to foster genius, doesn't just put past geniuses on pedestals. It works to embed their core insights, their way of thinking, into living systems.
And there's a deeper meaning to this humanist statue idea, too. It asks, are we designing our culture, our institutions, our social norms so that people don't have to suffer, die, or be exiled to have their most profound insights heard and considered?
Are we building systems that are actually strong enough, flexible enough, to carry the weight of genuinely transformative ideas without breaking or rejecting them?
Spinoza himself having his work suppressed, being excommunicated. The book suggests he was, in a way, sculpted by absence, forced by rejection to become this incredibly self-contained architecture of clarity just to survive intellectually.
But the source argues we can't and shouldn't rely on producing genius under that kind of trauma and pressure. We have to shift towards consciously building societies that don't fear original seeing, that don't automatically react to pattern-breaking clarity as a threat.
This requires a shift in perspective, seeing every human not as a potential monument to be revered after they're gone, but as a living repository of potentiality right now. We need to design for emergence.
Education systems could function as incubators for sovereign seeing, not just conformity. Urban design could consciously encode meaning and facilitate ethical interaction.
Because statues are static, they're fixed, they don't think, they don't evolve. Real humans do.
And the core point seems to be, you can't claim to honor past brilliance by casting it in bronze while simultaneously silencing, ignoring, or inhibiting the living brilliance trying to emerge around you today.
The real monument to genius, the source powerfully argues, isn't the statue in the town square. It's the system that remembers and applies the insight. It's the street designed for thoughtful connection. It's the social structure that enables freedom and clarity to flourish.
When a city carries deep memory in its zoning laws, not just its museums, when a community actively integrates philosophical depth into its governance, when our digital platforms are designed to defend space for challenging, nuanced thought,
then we are actively becoming what the statue only passively remembers. We're embodying the insight, not just observing it.
which leads directly into the book's conclusion titled, "The Last Genius is the One Who Doesn't Need to Be Killed."
That's a stark title.
It is, and it serves as a sharp reminder of how often the stories of profound, pattern-breaking insight throughout history end in tragedy. Suffering, censorship, exile, execution. Spinoza, Socrates, Hypatia, Galileo, Giordano Bruno. The list goes on.
We tend to protect the memory of these martyrs of thought, don't we? We build monuments to them after they're gone.
But we often fail to protect, or even recognize, the kind of mind that produces such insights while it's still alive and challenging the status quo. We build the statue, but we don't change the underlying system that made their suffering necessary in the first place.
We comfortably label them ahead of their time instead of asking the more uncomfortable question. Why was their time? Why is our time perhaps not ready for them? What's wrong with the architecture?
The book argues passionately that we need to fundamentally reverse this architecture of suffering. The genius of the future, the person with the next crucial pattern-breaking insight, shouldn't need to be rejected or persecuted.
A truly mature and conscious civilization, the argument goes, doesn't demand martyrdom as the price for clarity. It doesn't automatically treat fundamentally new ideas as existential threats.
Instead, its structures are designed to be adaptive. They evolve to meet new insight, to integrate it. Education aims to sharpen curiosity, not dull it. Institutions learn to value productive difference, not punish it. Neighborhoods become places that welcome thoughtful dissent, not exile it.
The ultimate goal is to evolve past the tragic necessity for people like Spinoza to endure such hardship just for their ideas to eventually maybe surface and make a difference.
Genius, in this ideal view, isn't a dangerous anomaly or a freak exception. It's a potential pattern, a natural fruit of a healthy, well-designed culture. So the call to action is clear. Stop just worshiping past genius and start actively designing the conditions for future genius.
Embed the insights, the principles, the ethics into the pavement, into the schools, into the algorithms, into the systems of governance.
A superculture is one that learns to absorb what was previously unabsorbable. It finds ways to include perspectives that were once exiled. It builds memory not as static history lessons, but as living operational design principles.
And the last genius, in this sense, is the one the system doesn't need to silence or destroy because the system itself has become intelligent enough, resilient enough, and ethical enough to welcome and integrate transformative clarity.
It's about turning those monuments into movements, turning remembrance into redesign, and consciously building a future where profound insight isn't tragically rare, but a welcomed and integrated part of societal evolution.
The epilogue wraps this up nicely, focusing on what happens after memory wins. It makes one final, crucial distinction.
Which is?
That memory isn't just about what we passively keep or remember, it's about what we actively build from. There's passive ornamental memory, like the statue we just talked about, versus active architectural memory.
Right. So the goal isn't just to memorize Spinoza's biography or his key philosophical points. It's to institute his core logic, his intellectual courage, his ethical clarity, to translate that into concrete operational systems.
Into laws, into educational curricula, into urban planning principles, into our social norms.
When memory, in this active sense, truly wins, it stops being just history and becomes the design brief for the present and the future. Imagine towns being designed today explicitly applying Spinoza's geometry of ethics or his arguments for freedom of thought directly into their physical layout, their governance structures, their public spaces.
It's not about idolizing the man, it's about taking the operating system update he offered and actually installing it, upgrading society so that transformative insight isn't seen as a bug or an exception, but as the next essential version.
When memory wins in this way, the source suggests thinkers with profound clarity are no longer seen as rare, dangerous anomalies. They're seen as living drafts of who we all could be, individually and collectively, if the system truly allowed and supported it. Memory moves from the dusty pages in a museum to the active protocols in municipal codes.
Ultimately, this whole deep dive points towards the need for a new kind of architecture. An architecture of ideas, yes, but critically also an architecture of ethics, and a physical architecture of cities and societies that actively remember, integrate, and build upon the deepest, most valuable insights humanity has produced.
It's a fundamental shift from fearing genius, or merely admiring it from afar, to consciously designing a world that welcomes, cultivates, and thrives on it.
So to wrap up, we've taken a pretty deep dive today into the rarity of genius, from Spinoza to conscious towns. We've explored how the profound, pattern-breaking clarity of minds like Baruch Spinoza minds, often rejected or exiled in their own time, might actually offer the blueprints for building better societies.
What the author calls a superculture or conscious towns, built by embedding the logic of genius into the very architecture of our world.
Yeah, it's a really powerful call to action, isn't it? It shifts the focus dramatically, away from just admiring historical figures from a distance,
towards actively designing the systems, the cities, the institutions that can actually cultivate, integrate, and scale up this kind of essential transformative insight, turning those passive monuments into living, breathing architecture.
And for you listening, this deep dive really challenges you to look differently at the world around you, to see the invisible architecture, the systems, the dominant ideas, the unspoken structures that shape your daily life.
It suggests that building a better future isn't just about adding new technologies or policies on top of the old structures. It might require fundamentally updating the core logic, the operating system itself, much like Spinoza dared to do centuries ago.
If a civilization is, as someone once said, like a sentence that manages to outlive its writer, think about the sentences being written architecturally and culturally in the world today.
And maybe consider this final thought. What kind of architecture, tangible or intangible, are you building, supporting, or perhaps challenging in your own corner of the world? What are you doing that might just make it a little bit safer, a little bit more welcoming for the next rare pattern-breaking insight to emerge and be heard?